All right, welcome back, everyone. So this is part 4 of Intimations of a New Worldview, and this is going to be about the scientific study of consciousness and how that relates to everything we've talked about up to this point. So let's do it. So I'm going to talk about, first what it is that I'm going to be doing in this part of the series. So Jordan Peterson claimed in Maps of Meaning that the metamythology was essentially characteristic of the development of consciousness. And he suggested that from the mythical perspective, from the mythological perspective, consciousness, the development of consciousness is akin to the creation of the world. So this is what he said about that, and I quote: "The metamythology of the way portrays the manner in which specific ideas about the present, the future, and the mode of transforming one into the other are initially constructed and then reconstructed in their entirety when such transformation becomes necessary. This metamyth provides the deep structure linking other classes of myths, including those describing the current or pre-existent stable state, those that portray the emergence of something unexpected into that state, those that represent the dissolution of paradise and consequence, and those that describe the regeneration of stability. This cyclic pattern is essentially characteristic of the development of consciousness, of the capacity to act and represent, which is regarded from the mythic perspective as akin to the creation of the world." So, strangely enough, I do think that this understanding of consciousness is well supported by modern scientific theory and research. That is, that the metamythology is describing the development of consciousness across time, both within individuals and over historical time, although we're not going to talk about the historical process here. We're just going to talk about it within individuals, but that the development of consciousness is akin to the metamythology, which is a strange claim, but I actually think it's pretty well supported. So I'm going to review evidence and theory related to the following claims in this part of the series. The first one is that consciousness emerges at the border between order and chaos in the brain. This is very well supported by multiple theories and a lot of research surrounding those theories. That the intensity of the conscious experience is associated with the complexification of brain states. That is, how conscious you are at any given moment, you might say. The process of complexification that I discussed in part 3 is therefore equivalent to the process by which consciousness develops over time, given that the complexity of brain states is associated with consciousness. We're also going to look at the so-called hard problem of consciousness, and we're going to see what this conception of consciousness, what this conception of conscious experience has to say about the hard problem or the nature of consciousness. And then finally, we're going to look at what all of this has to say about the causal status of consciousness. Is consciousness causally inert? Is it epiphenomenal? Or does it play an actual role in the development of the world around us? And of course, I'm going to argue that it does. So what is consciousness, right? When we're talking about consciousness, what is it that we're talking about? The mainstream definition of consciousness is generally attributable to Thomas Nagel in this famous paper from 1974, which was called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" I think that's the name of the paper. And he basically, said in that paper that to be conscious is to have something it is like to be you, right? There's something it is like to be you. There's not something it is like, as best I can tell, to be a rock or a spoon or a table, right? There's no experience associated with those objects, but there is an experience associated with being me. And so Anil Seth summarizes this idea in his book, Being You, and I quote: "For a conscious creature, there is something it is like to be that creature. There is something it is like to be me, something it is like to be you, and probably something it is like to be a sheep or a dolphin. For each of these creatures, subjective experiences are happening. It feels like something to be me. For an organism to be conscious, it has to have some kind of phenomenology for itself. Wherever there is experience, there is phenomenology. And wherever there is phenomenology, there is consciousness. Phenomenology being just our a description of our experience in the world. So that is what is meant generally by the term phenomenal consciousness. So in the literature, in the philosophical literature, there's often a distinction between phenomenal consciousness and what might be called access consciousness or self-consciousness. I'm not going to deal with that distinction here. I'm only concerned with phenomenal consciousness. And so I'm going to I'm just going to call it consciousness for the purposes of this part of the series. So there is a lot of ongoing philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness, about what it is and how consciousness relates to the physical world. There are some philosophers, the so-called illusionists or eliminativists, who do not really believe that consciousness exists at all, at least not in the way that most people understand it. They think it's a kind of illusion. Others, like the idealists or the panpsychists, believe that consciousness is pervasive, that consciousness doesn't emerge suddenly in nature, that it's always there to some extent in one way or another. Or the idealists just believe that everything is consciousness. Others, which you might call the emergentists, they believe that consciousness emerges given the right neural or anatomical configurations, right? So like, there is no consciousness. And then if you put a system in the right configuration, right, if you get it to do the right kind of thing, then consciousness emerges suddenly. And that's probably the most popular position. I think it's the most intuitive. I think it's also the most incoherent. I think it's wrong. And we'll talk about why I think it's wrong here in a minute. But I think that's the position that most people sort of intuitively adopt, is that, well, a rock isn't conscious, but a person is. And so there's some configuration that is necessary for the emergence of consciousness, and then, kind of poof, you get subjective experience. I think that idea is ultimately incoherent, but we'll talk about that more here in just a second. So in the philosophical debate about consciousness, there's a lot of talk about what's called the hard problem of consciousness. So most scientific research on consciousness focuses on understanding the physical correlates or the physical underpinnings of subjective experience. But this is not getting at the hard problem, right? So that's what you might call the easy problem. Anil Seth calls it the real problem. I think he's wrong about that. The hard problem is a real problem. It's not necessarily a scientific problem, but it is a real problem as far as I'm concerned. So David Chalmers probably has one of the most famous discussions of this in his 1996 book, The Conscious Mind. And he points out that besides looking at the neural correlates, or the physiological underpinnings, you might say, there's another question about consciousness that most research does not really address. And so this is how he talks about that, and I quote. He says, "Consciousness is the biggest mystery. It may be the largest outstanding obstacle in our quest for a scientific understanding of the universe. The science of physics is not yet complete, but it is well understood. The science of biology has removed many ancient mysteries surrounding the nature of life. There are gaps in our understanding of these fields, but they do not seem intractable. We have a sense of what a solution to these problems might look like. We just need to get the details right. Consciousness, however, is as perplexing as it ever was. It still seems utterly mysterious that the causation of behavior should be accompanied by a subjective inner life. We have good reason to believe that consciousness arises from physical systems such as brains, but we have little idea how it arises or why it exists at all. How could a physical system such as a brain also be an experiencer? Why should there be something it is like to be such a system? Present-day scientific theories hardly touch the really difficult questions about consciousness. We do not just lack a detailed theory. We are entirely in the dark about how consciousness fits into the natural order." End quote. Now, I do think that we now have a mainstream scientific theory that does address this question, and we'll talk about that more here in just a minute. But at least in 1996, there definitely was no mainstream scientific theory that even remotely, provided anything resembling a coherent answer to this question of what the real relation is between what we might call the physical, knock on wood, hard material reality and subjective experience. And it was very hard for anybody to conceptualize what that theory might even look like. And this is something, if you haven't thought about this that much, it may seem like it's not, you may think, oh, well, you just talk about, neurochemicals in the brain. But the problem is that there is no logically necessary connection between any brain state whatsoever, or at least we didn't think there was. I think there actually is now. At least there's a theory that provides one, but it's really hard to figure out what any kind of logically necessary connection there might be between any particular brain state and an experience. And so this is kind of what the hard problem is. And so many people agree, and I think, that the hard problem of consciousness arises because we have this intuition that we might call dualism. And this is the intuition that led Descartes to argue that mind and matter are totally different substances. Most people, most philosophers, most scientists will say that they reject dualism, but I'm not so sure about that. I think that many people implicitly take on many of the assumptions of dualism when they're thinking about consciousness. That is, they implicitly assume that subjective experience and physical material reality are totally distinct from each other in some important sense. And this colors all of our discussions of consciousness, and we'll come back to that here in a minute. So in this part of the series, I am mostly concerned with reviewing scientific literature about consciousness. I'm not going to go into too much of the weeds on the philosophical literature. I'm going to talk about it a little bit and then put forward a scientific understanding that I think helps to solve this problem. But for our purposes, it is enough to say that whatever explanation of the nature of consciousness that we put forward, it must not entail dualism. I reject that, right? So we have to reject the idea that consciousness and the physical material world are separate and fundamentally distinct from each other. And so in this view, consciousness must be continuous with the rest of nature and not something wholly separate and different from it. And we'll talk more about what that means later on. So I'm going to talk about a few options that are kind of put forward in the philosophical and scientific literature in terms of thinking about this problem of consciousness, right? The nature of consciousness. It's just not clear how it is that consciousness fits into the structure of the universe, given the assumptions of mainstream physicalism or dualism. And this hard problem, right, the so-called hard problem, has prompted a variety of responses from philosophers and scientists. As I said before, I think that most people, either implicitly or explicitly, they take on some version of what you might call emergentism, which suggests that conscious experience emerges out of what is wholly unconscious matter. Right? So given the right physical configuration, given the right circumstances, you go from having no conscious experience whatsoever, and then poof, there you go. Now you have some kind of subjective experience. And as I said, I think this is the most popular take on consciousness, but I also think it's the most incoherent. It's incoherent because it misunderstands the nature of emergence. So emergence is a very real phenomenon. Properties of systems emerge that are not inherent to the parts of the system. That's definitely the case. But emergence does not entail miracles, right? So, and that is what would be required for conscious experience to emerge from a wholly non-experiential underlying physical substrate, right? It would entail a kind of miracle, because the properties that emerge from the underlying substrates are not logically disconnected from those underlying substrates, right? So the behavioral properties of water, right? Water flows, water has surface tension and all this stuff. They emerge from the interactions of H2O molecules, and the H2O molecules do not have those properties, right? So that's an instance of emergence. Nevertheless, the behavioral properties of water can be logically derived from the structure of H2O, right? So we can understand, looking at an H2O molecule, we can understand why when you put a bunch of H2O molecules together with the right temperature, you get surface tension, you get flow, and things like that. But that is simply not the case for consciousness in the brain, right? Or at least it hasn't been the case. There is no, at least with the exception of integrated information theory, which I'll talk about later on. But there is basically no logically necessary reason for why any brain state ought to be associated with any particular experience. And what that kind of logical connection would even look like is virtually inconceivable. To argue that conscious experience emerges from a physical substrate that is wholly non-experiential would be to argue for what Galen Strawson has called brute emergence. And brute emergence entails a kind of miracle, right? So we don't get brute emergence when we're talking about the properties of water that emerge from the interactions of H2O molecules, because there is a logical connection between the properties of water and the properties of H2O molecules. There is no logical connection between the properties of consciousness, let's say, and the properties of the brain. Again, with one exception, but the exception doesn't entail emergence. So Galen Strawson, in this 2006 paper, explains why this explicit or implicit belief in the brute emergence of consciousness is so common. And so I'm going to quote him here, and he says about this, and I quote, "How did the notion of brute emergence ever gain currency? By one of the most lethal processes of theory formation or term formation that there is. The notion of brute emergence marks a position that seemingly has to exist if one accepts both the reality of phenomenal experience and the reality of the non-experiential. And since many people are irredeemably committed to both the reality of experience and the reality of the non-experiential, the notion of brute emergence comes to feel substantial to them by a kind of reflected holographical energy. It has to be there, given these unquestioned premises, which are felt to be so real." End quote. And so that's the fundamental intuition of dualism. Right? The fundamental intuition of dualism is that is that phenomenal experience is very real. Right? We are having a phenomenal experience, and there are non-experiential entities in the world. And if you wholly non-experiential, right? Wholly non-experiential entities in the world. And if you accept those premises, well, then brute emergence is really your only option. But brute emergence is incoherent. And so we will eventually reject one of those premises. So if you believe that your experience in the world is real, and if you believe that the physical world is wholly non-experiential, at least fundamentally, then brute emergence is the only possible conclusion. Now, the reason why so many philosophers have come to reject brute emergence is that, as I've talked about, this kind of emergence is totally unintelligible. It doesn't make any sense. Emergence is a very real phenomenon, but it does not entail miracles, right? The properties of the emergent phenomena can be logically linked to their underlying substrate, and that is not the case with conscious experience. Another option that we have when thinking about consciousness is illusionism. So I think one of the best discussions of the hard problem was given by Keith Frankish in his 2016 paper, Illusionism as a Theory of Consciousness. And he doesn't conceptualize it as a hard problem, but I still think it's a really good discussion of the options we have available to us given the anomalous nature of consciousness. And so we have previously discussed the metamythology as the process by which you update yourself in the face of anomalies. In phenomenal consciousness, if you're somebody who has this fundamental intuition of dualism, then phenomenal consciousness appears as an anomaly, right? It appears as an anomalous aspect of the world. And Frankish accurately describes the options that are available to us given this anomaly. So Frankish states, and I love the fact that he lays this out so clearly, despite the fact that I strongly disagree with his conclusion. He lays out the options extremely clearly. So I'm going to read what he says about this, and I quote. Suppose we encounter something that seems anomalous, in the sense of being radically inexplicable within our established scientific worldview. First, we could accept that the phenomenon is real and explore the implications of its existence, proposing major revisions or extensions to our science, perhaps amounting to a paradigm shift. Second, we could argue that, although the phenomenon is real, it is not in fact anomalous and can be explained within current science. Third, we could argue that the phenomenon is illusory and set about investigating how the illusion is produced. Frankish goes on to apply this scheme to phenomenal consciousness. He says, and I quote, "Turn now to consciousness. Conscious experience has a subjective aspect. We say it is like something to see colors, hear sounds, smell odors, and so on. Such talk is widely construed to mean that conscious experiences have introspectable qualitative properties or feels, which determine what it is like to undergo them. Various terms are used for these putative properties. I shall say that experiences with such properties are phenomenally conscious. Now, phenomenal properties seem anomalous. They are sometimes characterized as simple, ineffable, intrinsic, private, and immediately apprehended, and many theorists agree that they are distinct from all physical properties, inaccessible to third-person science, and inexplicable in physical terms. Again, there are three broad options." He goes on. First, there is radical realism, which treats phenomenal consciousness as real and inexplicable without radical theoretical innovation. And so what he means by that option is that in order to explain consciousness, we're going to have to radically alter our assumptions. He goes on. Second, there is conservative realism, which accepts the reality of phenomenal consciousness, but seeks to explain it in physical terms using the resources of contemporary cognitive science or modest extensions of it. And so by this, he means that phenomenal consciousness can be explained using our existing scientific tools and our existing scientific assumptions. He goes on. The third option is illusionism. This option shares radical realism's emphasis on the anomalousness of phenomenal consciousness and conservative realism's rejection of radical theoretical innovation. It reconciles these commitments by treating phenomenal properties as illusory. Illusionists deny that experiences have phenomenal properties and focus on explaining why they seem to have them. They typically allow that we are introspectively aware of our sensory states, but argue that this awareness is partial and distorted, leading us to misrepresent the states as having phenomenal properties. That is, he's denying that phenomenal consciousness actually exists. And those are the three options that we have, right? So we, in facing an anomaly, right, one of the things we can try to do is to incorporate the anomaly into our current structure, right? So we can try to use some cognitive tool that we already have to explain the anomaly without making any radical revisions. Another option that we have is if it doesn't fit into any current structure, let's say, we can radically dissolve, right? We can radically change our assumptions about the world in order to incorporate the anomaly. The third option that we have is to just simply deny that the anomaly exists. Right? Those are really the three options, and so I think he's right about that. And we'll come back to that here in a second. So Michael Graziano is another illusionist. He doesn't call himself an illusionist, but it is definitely what he is. And I think he's a little more clear about his position than Frankish is in some ways. So Graziano has claimed that we are machines that claim to be conscious, right? So we're nothing but machines. We're not really conscious. We don't really have phenomenal experiences, but we claim to, right? We claim to. We think we're having a subjective experience, but in fact, there is only information processing. So Graziano is also, I think, very clear about his motivations for denying the existence of consciousness. And so he says about this, and I quote, "One cannot push on subjective experience and measure a reaction force, scratch it and measure its hardness, or put it on a scale and measure its weight. It does not exist on these physical dimensions. In the sense of its physical non-measurability, subjective experience is non-physical, or even metaphysical in the strict sense of being above or outside the physical. This ethereal nature of subjective experience is precisely why it has been so difficult to understand. But objectively speaking, the phenomenon that faces us is much simpler. A brain-controlled agent constructs a self-description and on that basis makes claims about itself. There is no rational reason to suppose the claims are literally accurate." So you might suspect that I think Graziano is very, 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 very confused. But he is more consistent than many thinkers on this subject. So I've said that emergentism, brute emergence, is incoherent. Illusionism is not incoherent. It's a perfectly coherent position to take, despite the fact that it's fucking insane. If you accept the ontology, which says that only what is physical is real, right, and that what is physical is fundamentally non-experiential, then the coherent conclusion that you have to come to, right, is that subjective experience must be non-existent, right? And so, again, I've said that brute emergence is incoherent, but this is coherent, right? It is coherent, and that is the fundamental motivation behind illusionism, right? So you can see that with Frankish, you can see that with Graziano. They have this fundamental intuition of dualism, that the physical and the experiential are wholly different properties of the world. And because of that, because the experiential doesn't fit into their physical descriptions of the world, they have to deny its existence. And that is the fundamental motivation behind illusionism. So in the face of this so-called anomaly, right, which for them is an anomaly, for me it's not, okay, but for them it's an anomaly, right, and it consists of phenomenal consciousness, illusionists simply deny that it exists, right, and they attempt to explain why it seems like it exists, which is a contradiction in terms, by the way, because if it seems like you're having an experience, you are having an experience. They're misusing the language here, but we won't get into that too deeply. This is the stupidest idea that any human being has ever had in the history of the world since the dawn of time. And I do believe that. There have been a lot of stupid ideas since the dawn of time, but this is the stupidest. If your theory is continually contradicted by your own experience in the world, then you should really try to rethink your theory. But if your theory is continually contradicted by the very fact that you are having an experience in the world, you should hang your head in shame and go think about what you've done for the next 20 years or so. Galen Strawson put it this way, and I quote, "Some philosophers are so enthralled to the fundamental intuition of dualism, the intuition that the experiential and the physical are utterly and irreconcilably different, that they are prepared to deny the existence of experience. They are prepared to deny the existence of experience. At this, we should stop and wonder. I think we should feel very sober and a little afraid at the power of human credulity, the capacity of human minds to be gripped by theory, by faith. For this particular denial is the strangest thing that has ever happened in the whole history of human thought, not just the whole history of philosophy. It falls, unfortunately, to philosophy, not religion, to reveal the deepest woo-woo of the human mind. I find this grievous, but next to this denial, every known religious belief is only a little less sensible than the belief that the grass is green. And I think Strawson is being very charitable with this description. So, if brute emergence is incoherent and illusionism is positively stupid, what are our options? Well, we're going to come back to this problem at the end of part 4, after we've reviewed the scientific theory and evidence about this stuff. So I will suggest that there is a scientific theory which does address the so-called hard problem, or the nature of consciousness in a meaningful way, and that's integrated information theory. Integrated information theory does not fall prey to the problems that are inherent to brute emergence or to illusionism. Integrated information theory posits that consciousness is continuous. Consciousness is continuous with the rest of nature. It doesn't entail dualism. To many people, this theory seems to have radical implications. It does not seem that way to me, but I think that my assumptions are quite different from most people about these things. So, and actually, probably not most people, right? Probably just most scientists studying this and philosophers studying this. I think that most scientists and philosophers studying this have a particular temperament that leads them to have certain intuitions about the world that I don't share because I don't share their temperament, let's say. But that's an issue for another time. So we're going to discuss this stuff at the end of part 4. We'll come back to this issue of the nature of consciousness. So there are really two questions, right, when we're studying consciousness scientifically. The first is the function of consciousness, right? What is it for, if anything, right? Does it have some kind of biological function? The second question is what the relationship is between the physical world and consciousness. So, right, what is the nature of consciousness? What is its metaphysical or ontological status in the world? Why is it that consciousness seems to be a property of some physical entities, like a person, but not others, like a rock or a table or a spoon? And so what exactly is consciousness, right, from a naturalistic perspective? That's the nature question. So I'm going to talk about both of these questions here, and we're going to see that multiple theories have suggested that the function of consciousness is related in some kind of indeterminate way. I'm not exactly precise about this, but it is definitely related to relevance realization, and there are theories that are very explicit about the relationship of consciousness to relevance realization. So we're going to talk about that. And then the nature of consciousness is really... there's only really one mainstream theory of consciousness that deals seriously with the nature of consciousness, in my opinion, and that's integrated information theory. We're going to see how consciousness is related to this process of complexification that we discussed in part 3. And of course, since relevance realization is that process of complexification as it manifests in cognitive development, right, that connection to the process of complexification is not that unsurprising. So let's get into it. The first theory I want to talk about is called global workspace theory. Global workspace theory is a theory of consciousness which suggests that what consciousness is brain-wide information sharing. Sounds kind of similar to integrated information, but we'll get back to that. So Dehaene summarizes global workspace theory as such, and I quote, "My collaborators and I have elaborated a theory that we call global neuronal workspace. We propose that consciousness is global information broadcasting within the cortex. It arises from a neuronal network whose reason for existence is the massive sharing of pertinent information throughout the brain. The philosopher Daniel Dennett aptly called this idea fame in the brain. Thanks to the global neuronal workspace, we can keep in mind any idea that makes a strong imprint on us for however long we choose, and make sure that it gets incorporated into our future plans, whatever they might be. Thus, consciousness has a precise role to play in the computational economy of the brain. It selects, amplifies, and propagates relevant thoughts." End quote. And that's interesting, right? Because the function of consciousness, according to global workspace theory, is to select, amplify, and propagate relevant thoughts. So it's clearly playing an important role in relevance realization. So there are a couple things I want to bring your attention to about this. One of them is relevance realization, but the other one is that consciousness in this view is integrating information together. And he's more explicit about this further down on the same page. He said, "We believe that a special set of neurons diffuses conscious messages throughout the brain, these giant cells whose long axons crisscross the cortex, interconnecting it into an integrated whole." And so And so this idea of fame in the brain, of global information sharing, right? Well, this is a way to integrate information together into a single coherent experience. And of course, he said, explicitly that consciousness is about relevance realization. And I'll say something else about this, or quote him again on this, a different passage where he's a little bit more clear about it. He says, and I quote, "At any moment, our sensory environment is buzzing with myriad potential perceptions. Likewise, our memory is teeming with knowledge that could, in the next instant, surface back into our consciousness. In order to avoid information overload, many of our brain systems therefore apply a selective filter. Out of countless potential thoughts, what reaches our conscious mind is la creme de la creme, the outcome of the very complex sieve that we call attention. Our brain ruthlessly discards the irrelevant information and ultimately isolates a single conscious object based on its salience or its relevance to our current goals. This stimulus then becomes amplified and able to orient our behavior." Okay, so consciousness in this view, and that's the end of the quote, consciousness in this view is bringing relevant information into a global workspace where it is integrated into a coherent whole, which is an experience. Global workspace theory compares consciousness to the desktop of a computer. Now, we don't want to be too literal about that. We're not computers, but it is an interesting metaphor anyway. So in this view, consciousness allows you to bring relevant information into awareness so that many different parts of the brain can have access to it. Consciousness, and I'm quoting here, compresses the incoming information, reducing an immense stream of sense data to a small set of carefully selected bite-sized symbols, right? So the world is way too complex for us to take in all of it. There's way too much information. We have to narrow that down to some small subset that's relevant to us, and that's relevance realization, and that's what consciousness is playing an integral role in, according to this theory. And this is not going to be so different from how integrated information theory thinks about consciousness, although there are differences in emphasis and differences in some of the predictions. It's very similar in many ways. Now, one of the things I want to focus on here about global workspace theory is that it has put forward some empirically verifiable signatures of consciousness, some physiological signatures of consciousness. And the one I want to focus on here is called the ignition event. So when you present somebody with information subliminally, so that they can react to the information, but it's beneath their conscious awareness, and there's a variety of ways you can do this. You can flash it so quickly that they don't really process it consciously, but they still are able to react to it. You can do like backward masking and things like this. So if you present information to somebody subliminally so that it's not conscious, their brain will react to it, but the brain activity remains highly localized, right? So it remains localized in one part of the brain. So like if they're reading, there's a network in your left hemisphere that is associated with reading a word. So if you present a word to somebody subliminally, you'll activate some things in that left hemisphere network, but it doesn't spread throughout the entire brain. In contrast, when we become consciously aware of something, the brain has a burst of large-scale, widespread activity. And they call this the ignition event. And it's been likened to an avalanche, which should sound familiar to us. So this is what Dehaene said about that, and I quote, "This collective phenomenon resembles what physicists call a phase transition, or mathematicians a bifurcation, a sudden, nearly discontinuous change in the state of a physical system. Most physical self-amplifying systems possess a tipping point, where global change happens or fails depending on minute impurities or noise. The brain, we reasoned, may be no exception." End quote. This should sound very familiar, right? So we talked in the second part of this series about self-organized criticality in the sandpile model. The sandpile model says that criticality is when you're right at that tipping point where the avalanche, where one more grain of sand could tip the pile into going into an avalanche, which is a phase transition, which is the ignition event, according to this idea. So complex systems in nature, you may recall, can self-organize to that narrow window between order and chaos. And at that narrow window, they display avalanche events or phase changes, where we can find an increase in complexity. So could it be, right? Could it be that this tipping point being described by Dehaene in the brain is a self-organized critical phenomenon, right? Is it self-organized criticality? And we'll come back to this question in just a little bit after we take a look at integrated information theory. The answer is obviously yes, but we're going to come back to it. Because somebody else has done the integration for me, and we're going to look at their work. So now we're going to move on to talk about integrated information theory. So as far as I'm concerned, Integrated information theory is the only scientific theory of consciousness that deals seriously with what some people call the hard problem, or the nature of consciousness. Most theories just don't care about that much, or at least not explicitly. They may have something to say about it, but most theories are not really that concerned with the nature of consciousness. Unlike other theories, and IIT is different from other theories in another way too. It starts with a phenomenological analysis of our conscious experience. So it starts from our experience of the world itself. It starts by examining the properties of our own experience in the world. And it uses those properties to derive what are called axioms of experience. So some basic fundamental assumptions about what any experience must require. These axioms are then used to derive hypotheses or predictions about the properties that a physical system must possess in order to have a conscious experience. These properties are used to derive a mathematical measure called phi. Phi is a measure of the amount of consciousness in a given system. And so according to integrated information theory, consciousness is graded. There's a continuum of consciousness. So like we are clearly conscious creatures, but so is a slug, right? A slug, according to integrated information theory, a slug would be conscious too, but not as conscious as us, right? So it would have an experience, but not as intense and not as complex as our own experience. And the same thing is true all the way down the line to the very simple organisms. So I'm going to read some things that have been said about integrated information theory, which can provide a kind of summary of what it's about. So Strawson, in this 2021 paper, says this about it, and I quote, "A simple exercise of introspection indicates that each experience is both integrated, that is, each conscious scene is unified, and each experience is highly differentiated, that is, each experience is specific, differing from a huge number of different conscious states at any given time. Thus, the neural process underlying conscious experience must be functionally integrated and at the same time highly differentiated." Well, that hopefully sounds familiar too, right? Because that's the definition of complexity that we talked about in part 3. The definition of complexity that we talked about in part 3 was any system that is both highly differentiated and integrated at the same time. To the extent that a system is both differentiated and integrated, it is more complex than less differentiated or integrated systems. Popiel and colleagues in a 2020 paper said this about it, and I quote, "Integrated information theory is a top-down phenomenological approach to defining consciousness. Starting from phenomenological axioms inherently true for all conscious experiences, mathematical postulates have been put forth, creating a workspace for quantitative research on consciousness. The main measure proposed by integrated information theory is the mathematical entity called integrated conceptual information, or phi, which generally seeks to measure how much the whole is greater than the sum of its parts of the causal structure being studied." Okay, so a couple things I want to say about that. In the first place, as they say in the first sentence, integrated information theory is an approach to defining consciousness. It's a definition of consciousness. It's a mathematically precise definition of what consciousness is. And it says that consciousness is the extent to which a system is greater than the sum of its parts for any causal structure being studied. And there's a very precise way of thinking about that. You know, you might think that like a society, for example, is greater than the sum of its parts. And it is in some important sense, but not according to the definition of complexity with IIT. So society as a whole is not conscious according to IIT. You might think that like a spoon is greater than the sum of its parts, right? Because of course a spoon is useful, but the little individual iron atoms that make up the spoon are not that useful, right? But not according to IIT, right? So you know, we have to be precise with our definitions here, and there's a very precise mathematical way that IIT defines wholes, right? Defines emergent wholes that are greater than the sum of their parts. And it doesn't include aggregates, like a spoon is an aggregate, a society is an aggregate, but we are not, right? We are emergent wholes. And so for integrated information theory, consciousness simply is integrated information, right? That's what consciousness is according to integrated information theory. So Anil Seth, in his book Being You, I think he provides, even though the book isn't about integrated information theory, I think it does provide a nice summary of what phi is. This term phi, which is the measure of consciousness in a system, this is what Seth says about it, and I quote, "In integrated information theory, Phi measures the amount of information a system generates as a whole, over and above the amount of information generated by its parts independently. This underpins the main claim of the theory, which is that a system is conscious to the extent that its whole generates more information than its parts. Notice that this is not merely a claim about a correlation, nor is it a real problem-style proposal about how mechanistic properties of a system account for properties of phenomenology. Rather, it is a claim about identity. According to integrated information theory, the level of phi is intrinsic to a system, meaning that it does not depend on an external observer, and it is identical to the amount of consciousness associated with that system. High phi means lots of consciousness. Zero phi means no consciousness. So, phi quantifies, that's the end of the quote, phi quantifies the extent to which a system is more than the sum of its parts and is identical to the consciousness inherent to that system. Now, integrated information theory associates consciousness with the complexity of brain states, right? The extent to which brain states are both highly differentiated and highly integrated. And regardless of whether integrated information theory proves ultimately to be correct, right? So regardless, at some point in time, some other theory will come along that's more precise, presumably, right? That's the way science works. Regardless of that, the association between consciousness and the complexity of brain states is well established empirically. I'm not going to review all the evidence for that here. You'll have the papers in the description. I'll have the references there if you really want to go look at all of that. So I'm just going to tell you what the conclusion was for this 2021 review paper by Strawson and colleagues, where they review the evidence for the association between complexity and consciousness. And I quote, "We have highlighted an interesting trajectory traversing the science of consciousness over the last 2 decades. The emerging consilience is that measures of complexity, all designed to capture the joint presence of integration and differentiation in the brain, represent reliable indices of the state of consciousness," end quote. And that is the case. There's a lot of evidence for overlap between the complexity of brain states and the presence of conscious experience. So, moving on to talk about the association between phi and self-organized criticality. So I'm going to presume that you remember what we've talked about previously in regards to self-organized criticality. Interestingly, there is a growing literature on the relationship between phi and self-organized criticality, meaning that phi is maximized, consciousness is maximized at the narrow window between order and chaos in the brain. That's what this literature indicates. For example, Kim and Lee, in a 2019 paper, used a network model to test whether criticality was associated with maximum phi. They also looked at EEG data, so electroencephalogram data, comparing the brain activity of people with various levels of anesthetic. So they gave people anesthetic, and then they saw if signatures of criticality would correlate with the level of consciousness associated with the drop in consciousness, the alleviation of consciousness that happens when you give somebody an anesthetic. And here's what they said about that, and I quote, "In this paper, we demonstrated empirically explicit relationships between criticality, integrated information, and consciousness at various levels of human consciousness modulated with a general anesthetic, and also performed a computational model study to understand how the brain at a critical state facilitates the development of a large amount of integrated information at a network level." So what they showed in that paper was an empirical connection between the amount of consciousness that somebody is experiencing, right? So when you give somebody a general anesthetic, they go unconscious and their brain moves away from criticality. And then they also used a computational model to demonstrate that in this model, that is what you find, that integrated information lessens by quite a bit as soon as you move away from criticality. Now, they are replicating another finding from a study from 2016, which found that unconsciousness is accompanied by a loss of signatures of criticality. That's Tagliazucci and colleagues in 2016, and they said, and I quote, that "Our research provides evidence that the baseline state of wakeful rest presents critical dynamics, and that unconscious brain states depart from this kind of dynamics." So when you are conscious, your brain presents critical dynamics, meaning it's at the border between order and chaos. And when you go unconscious, it moves away from those dynamics. And this also replicates a previous study showing that administering an anesthetic reduces information integration capacity. That's Lee and colleagues, 2009. I won't go over that in any detail. So now we're going to look at integrated information theory and global workspace theory with self-organized criticality. So we talked earlier about the ignition event and that it may be a self-organized critical phenomenon. Enzo Tagliazucci, in a 2017 paper, made this claim explicitly. He explicitly links the ignition event described in global workspace theory with the mathematical models provided by integrated information theory. And he said about this, and I quote, "Under the hypothesis that large-scale propagation of activity in the brain, meaning the ignition event, is tuned to this critical point, maximal or close to maximal values of phi were observed." So when you see that ignition event, you see maximal values of phi as well. So the ignition event being described by global workspace theory is a self-organized critical event in which phi is maximized, right? That's the implication of this paper. So we see that the signature of consciousness, according to global workspace theory, which is the ignition event, and the measure of consciousness, according to integrated information theory, which is phi, have converged, right? They've converged around this idea of self-organized criticality, the idea that they both emerge, right? They both are maximized, or integrated information is maximized, and the ignition event occurs at the border between order and chaos in the brain. Now, I would say my assumption here is that when two theories with very different conceptual foundations can agree on something like this, it's usually a good sign that they're onto something. Integrated information theory and global workspace theory have very different assumptions and very different backgrounds, very different intellectual backgrounds, but they converge on this. And so I would say that's a good sign that they're onto something. So we're going to talk briefly about the cognitive science of insight here. We've talked about this before in part 2. You'll notice that when artists depict an insight, when they depict somebody having an insight, they put a light bulb over their head in like cartoons. And that light bulb is meant to convey something about the phenomenology of insight. When you have an insight, you have this flash, right? You have this flash of conscious awareness. It's like the lights come on. And that's how we talk about it. The lights came on, and I realized, the solution to the problem. At the moment of the insight, the intensity of the conscious experience increases. And this should be expected, right? So we've talked about how an insight has been argued to be a self-organized critical phenomenon. And so we would expect for there to be a relationship between the amount of consciousness, let's say, and the experience of an insight, given that it occurs at criticality. So we're now going to move on to talk about the scientific study of psilocybin. So this is another research literature which has independently of global workspace theory, independently of integrated information theory, associated consciousness with criticality. You may be aware that there has been a recent explosion of research on psilocybin and other psychedelics because the federal government has relaxed their regulations around this stuff. And psilocybin, if you're not aware, is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. So a single dose of psilocybin in a controlled setting has been associated with some very interesting benefits. I'm definitely not saying that psilocybin is like a cure-all, and the setting that you take it in very much matters, and your mindset when you take it very much matters, but at least in the context of these clinical trials that have been done, it's helped people with depression, it's helped lower death anxiety in cancer patients, it's helped people with nicotine addiction, and it's facilitated a greater sense of meaning and connectedness in people. A single dose has also been shown to increase trait openness to experience, one of the big 5 traits, a year after, all the way a year after the dose. So a single dose has done that. And to decrease authoritarian political beliefs, both of which are very interesting, I would say. People often describe their experience with psilocybin as what you might call an expanded state of consciousness. That's how people describe it. And Carhart-Harris, so Robin Carhart-Harris has done a lot of this research in the last decade or maybe a little more. He's done a lot of this research, and he has put forward a theory about the mechanism underlying the psilocybin experience, which we're now going to take a look at. So in their 2014 paper, which was called The Entropic Brain, a Theory of Conscious States Informed by Neuroimaging Research with Psychedelic Drugs, Carhart Harris and colleagues put forward a theory about the mechanism underlying the psilocybin experience in the brain. And they reviewed evidence in that paper that the brain, so while criticality is necessary for consciousness, the brain can support a range of conscious states that are around criticality. So it doesn't have to be like perfect, that perfect criticality. There's a range of states that can support consciousness. And those states that are around criticality are associated with different phenomenological characteristics. They review evidence that most people, and we talked about this in part 3, most people during normal waking consciousness are near the bottom of this range, right? So there's a range of states around criticality that we could be at. Most people are near the bottom, which is slightly subcritical. That is, most people are slightly tilted towards order, towards having too much order. So what psilocybin does is it increases entropy in the brain. Entropy is a measure of uncertainty, unpredictability. You can think of it as chaos, basically. Entropy. So by increasing the amount of entropy in the brain, psilocybin moves people closer to true criticality. Given what we've already reviewed here, given this relationship between criticality and phi, which is consciousness, this is likely to be the mechanism, right? It makes sense that psilocybin would be associated with what people refer to as an expanded state of consciousness. Indeed, like it's literally the case that if we define consciousness as phi, there is more consciousness at criticality. So this does mean that when you are moving the brain closer to criticality, you become more conscious. And that's probably what people are describing when they talk about it as an expanded state of consciousness. So this is just a figure depicting what's going on here. So there's a range of states that are at the border between order and chaos in the brain that can support consciousness. Most people are slightly tilted towards the order side of that range. Sedatives, what sedatives do basically is they tilt you into order, right? So they make the brain more orderly, and that moves you out of the conscious range. Psychedelics, on the other hand, increase entropy, which means that they move you closer to chaos. But because most people are slightly tilted towards order, that actually moves you closer to criticality and makes you more conscious, let's say. And I say this figure is not to scale because the range of conscious states, given the total number of states that the brain could be in, the range of conscious states is very likely much narrower than this. But of course, it would have been hard to depict that, so so it's not to scale. So, as we discussed earlier, psilocybin has this strange capacity to induce long-term changes in people's personality and their mood. It generally changes that most people would consider to be positive, at least in the clinical trials. I'm not saying it always happens that way, but in the clinical trials, it has happened that way. And the mechanism underlying these changes is thought to be insight, right? People have spontaneous insights while they are under the influence of psilocybin. And this makes perfect sense, right? We've already talked about how insight is argued to be a self-organized critical phenomenon. And so it makes sense that if you move the brain closer to criticality, people are going to be more likely to have spontaneous insights. Carhart Harris, in a 2018 paper, talks about this, and I quote, he says, "The ability of psychedelics to relax prior assumptions may provide the necessary preconditions for the emergence of spontaneous insight. Conceptually, it seems reasonable to suppose that attunement of brain activity towards criticality may be a mechanism underlying spontaneous insight under psychedelics. Avalanche phenomena or cascading processes in response to intrinsic perturbation are signatures of critical systems and may be involved in the disinhibition and associated release of previously inhibited information under psychedelics." End quote. Now, I think Carhart Harris is being a little more cautious there than he needs to be. So he doesn't cite like Stephan and Dixon. So the Stephan and Dixon 2009, the stuff they did in 2009, 2010, associating insight with criticality. I suspect that if he was aware of that stuff, he would be a little bit less cautious about this. It's not just reasonable, like it makes perfect sense that the attunement of brain activity towards criticality would be the mechanism underlying spontaneous insight under psychedelics, given that insight has been argued to be a self-organized critical phenomenon in the scientific literature. So this is so on the right side of the screen there is the metamythology, that is the structure of an insight. This is what happens at the border between order and chaos. So by increasing entropy in the brain, psychedelics decrease one's confidence in their precision, let's say, but they decrease their confidence in what are called high-level priors, which can be thought of as the deep ways that we are framing the world. and that those deep ways that we are framing the world can then be broken up safely under the influence of psilocybin. At least most of the time it's safe. Again, setting is important. And this increased entropy, it loosens up these frames, right? It allows them to dissolve and allows you to have an insight, which is where you reframe the world. So just to summarize what we've talked about here. So we've gone over research on global workspace theory, integrated information theory, the cognitive science of insight, the cognitive science of psilocybin. And we've seen that these have all converged on this idea that there is a tight coupling, a relationship between self-organized criticality and phenomenal consciousness. And what I would suggest is that when you see the same pattern emerge across multiple disparate frameworks, right, which and using multiple methodologies, it's very likely that there's something real and important about it. And in this case, I think it's virtually, it's extremely likely for it to be the case that there is a tight relationship between criticality and consciousness, given that we find this relationship across these multiple frameworks, which are largely separate from each other. They don't really cite each other, and they haven't really been influenced by each other that much. Multiple frameworks for thinking about consciousness have converged on this idea that consciousness emerges at the border between order and chaos in the brain. So that is the end of video 1 of part 4. In the next video in this series, we're going to spend a lot more time linking this to the metamythology and explaining why it is that consciousness research lines up so nicely with the metamythology as it was described by Jordan Peterson. There's a good logical reason for why this would be the case, and we're going to talk about that in video 2 of part 4. See you there.